Hello, everyone. I'm Alistair Woodward, and it's my job to talk to you about AR6. I'm sorry that I can't be present at the meeting physically. Instead, I'm going to offer you a short video to tell you in a nutshell what the IPCC has been up to and offer some comments on how I think this relates to New Zealand. Let me start my slides. Right, here we are. So the main findings of AR6 and what, in my mind, these mean for New Zealand. Well, the first point to make is that the assessment report is enormous. And James Rennick, who's a colleague and was one of the scientists contributing to the AR6, claims that there were 7,700 pages of information produced during the assessment round, a number of volumes. I had no idea what 7,700 pages might look like, and so I pulled books off my bookshelf and put them on the desk here, as you can see. So an absolute, potentially overwhelming quantity of information included in this assessment report. And so I'm giving you a tip here that if you go to the synthesis report, which was published this year and is an attempt to combine in one volume the essential points from all the remainder of the assessment report, you'll find there is a summary for policymakers at the beginning. And so that's got 40 pages. That's more manageable, perhaps. And it's an attempt to sift out the nuggets of gold, the really essential aspects of the report, and present them. And so that's not a bad place to start if you want to go to the report and get a sense for the flavor, the style, the content of what's included. I'm going to make some personal points. These are my own personal reflections, really, I have to say. My part in the report was to act as one of the writing team for the chapter on Australia and New Zealand, and I've been involved with assessments in the past, so this is not foreign territory to me, and I always find it a fascinating experience to be part of this assessment. It's so ambitious, and the findings are so important. So what were the findings this time round? Well, I think the climate science just makes the point that we face an immense challenge. And here's one aspect to this challenge that hadn't struck me so forcefully until I read the synthesis report. Here I'm showing you that since the second half of the 19th century, the world's warmed by about 1.1 degrees. That's the bar down the bottom. The point is that that's a combination, it's the net effect of greenhouse warming, that's the greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane that have been released into the atmosphere, which have a heating effect, they trap energy, and the aerosols, which on the whole have a cooling effect. They tend to reflect incoming solar radiation. So the greenhouse gases that have already been released into the atmosphere, have provided or would provide of the order of 1.5 degrees of warming. And the balance, the difference between 1.5 and 1.1 is attributable to the effect of the aerosols, that the smoke and dust that are in the atmosphere that cool the planet. The importance of this point is that, of course, we're working really hard to clean up the air, to reduce the amount of aerosol, smoke and dust and so on. And when that's achieved, as it will be, then that embedded warming will be uncovered. And global temperatures will lurch upwards. One of the reasons why people are rather pessimistic about our prospects for meeting the 1.5 guideline. Here's an infographic that just makes the same points really and adds a couple more. This point that more likely than not we'll go past 1.5, and that will happen quite soon, even under optimistic emissions scenarios. Sea level rise, of course, in many respects, one of the most important aspects of global warming, is unavoidable. Just the momentum in the climate system in terms of how oceans respond is unstoppable. These are changes that will play out over a very long time frame. And current commitments, the Paris Agreement, the NCDs, and the plans that have been made and commitments that have been made are consistent with warming of almost 3 degrees. So that's well over twice the warming that we've already experienced by 2100, unless climate action accelerates. So urgency, major problems. Another point that would be quite familiar to New Zealanders now from the IPCC report is that adaptation is now front and center stage, because all around the world we're seeing larger extreme weather events than have occurred in the past, more severe, more energetic extreme events, storms, heat waves, floods, and so on. And more certain than ever that these events are attributable to human-induced climate change. On the right-hand side there on the slide, you can see just an example of that. Luke Harrington from the University of Waikato has graphed the rainfall that we saw in Auckland in January 2023, and that's the blue line. And you can see the peak rainfall is just off the chart. It's 80% greater than anything that's been experienced before or recorded before over the last 60 years. And this is unfortunately a feature that is often reported, that it's not just that heating and flooding and rainfall intensity are unprecedented, but the surge in the peaks are most remarkable. And of course, that's what makes these events so difficult to manage. This point, I think it's so important, it should be printed out and posted on the front door of every local government, that because adaptation is front and center stage doesn't mean that we can give up on mitigation. That just makes no sense, but it's been the response of many people faced with the urgencies of, the rainfall, the floods, the storms in New Zealand earlier in the year. And I like the way that the IPCC sums it up. And they said that every increment in temperature causes extra harm. So that's the first point. If we don't rein in climate change, then the severity of the floods and storms that we'll experience in the future will dwarf what we've already experienced. And then the second point, that every increment in temperature shrinks the adaptation space. In other words, makes it more difficult for us to avoid harm due to extreme events, because the margin of error is just thinner. I've put up here a picture of the Cool Roofs project, just as an example. This is a very ingenious intervention which looks to reduce indoor temperatures in parts of the world that can't afford other passive cooling devices, insulation, air conditioning, and so on, by adding a simple reflective layer to roofs, mud roofs, corrugated iron, and so on, to reduce temperatures indoors. Aditi Bunker from our university and Heidelberg has been leading this work, originally developed in Africa and tested in Africa, and now being rolled out in the Pacific. A simple approach to adapting to higher temperatures, but obviously its effectiveness is greatly reduced if as temperatures continue to climb. The assessment report AR6 uses a term, climate resilient development, that I think is a really helpful construction. And the point is that we need to combine to think about adaptation, mitigation, and equity. They go together. The fair transition, one that combines preparing to reduce the harm of climate change, as well as doing our best to reduce the extent of climate change. We've got to look for the 3-in-1 in terms of climate actions. And here's an example of just one that I think, goes some way towards meeting that ideal. The development of electric vehicles in low-income settings. And this is an example of electric rickshaws in India that are not only good for local employment, they reduce local pollution, they reduce noise, and of course they cut carbon emissions because people are using electric motors rather than diesel or petrol motors. One of the criticisms that's been made of New Zealand policies and climate, and I think it's warranted, is that we've tended to think short term. And the IPCC report over and over again emphasizes the need to look further ahead, to plan long term. And when it comes to adaptation, the argument is that rather than planning for what's most likely in the next decade or so, we should be thinking about what's the worst plausible outcome and preparing for that. It's a frame of mind that is not unfamiliar, really. If you think about insurance, that generally people think about really bad outcomes they want to avoid rather than thinking about what's most likely in the next year or so. And an example is how we approach coastal protection, where in New Zealand and other countries, the design standards have been limited in the past to thinking about 1 in 100-year events. In the Netherlands, coastal protection now needs to meet standards that are based not on 1 in 100-year events, but 1 in 10,000-year events. So thinking very much longer term. What does this mean for the health system? Well, lots, but I've just picked out 3 points here. I'm sure the conference will range far more widely, but here are 3 points to think about. One is the obvious one about in the health system modeling good practice in terms of waste reduction, in terms of transport, in terms of food provision, and so on. Second point, again, a sort of obvious one, making the health system more responsive to natural disasters. I mean, that's a necessity in the near term, as well as being part of good planning longer term for climate. The third point, perhaps you wouldn't have thought so much about this, but I increasingly believe it's a really important point, communicating more effectively than we have in the past the ways in which health gains from wise, well-chosen climate action. And speed management, the newspaper article down the bottom, speed management plans in the transport sector have often been framed in terms of what people lose, framed in terms of partisan action from those opposed to cars who just want to get rid of traffic. And of course, there's much more to it than that. Jared Gilbert, who writes for the Herald, comes from Christchurch, isn't a health reporter, but he wrote this very nice piece earlier in the year about his experience of low speed zones introduced in Christchurch, which delivered all kinds of surprises, he said, in terms of increased sociability, increased opportunity for people to walk and cycle and kids to play. when traffic moves less quickly. So those are the gains. If we can frame transport as a public health activity, as a public health issue, then we hopefully will be able to achieve both climate equity and local health gain in the one go, the three in one go. Well, conclusions, a mix of adverse warnings, I suppose, but some elements of rescue. Global emissions, according to the latest IPCC report, continue on what is a plainly unsustainable trajectory. Extreme events like the flooding and storms that we've seen here in New Zealand are much more likely under climate change. They now cover larger extents and they are more severe. Climate resilient development, that's the conception that I like. I think it's a good way of framing climate action. It includes equity, the fair transition is, just central. Mitigation, how we prevent climate change and slow its advance, and adaptation. All those are necessary. The fourth point, it's one that maybe the IPCC report doesn't present as strongly as it could, is that there is no shortage of success and many opportunities to learn from examples of health supporting mitigation, health supporting adaptation, equitable transitions. All those things are happening, and the challenge is to bring them to into the fore and use them as the center point for discussion. I'd like to finish by recommending that if you haven't yet looked at it, check out the series of 10 short videos for Newsroom that Rod Oram prepared and was shown earlier this year. Called The Way Forward. They examine different aspects of what can be achieved, what's already being achieved in New Zealand in terms of climate action. And the video that's been downloaded most frequently, has been viewed most frequently, is episode 8, which is on the topic of learning from Māori knowledge, based on Ngāti Whātua's activities here in Auckland, at Aotearoa, but not just at Aotearoa, elsewhere in the city as well. So I'm going to just finish my sharing and say, I hope that's given you a sense of AR6, a quick run through the major findings, my sense of what the implications are for New Zealand. And if you've got questions, if you want to discuss these things with me further, I'm very happy to receive emails, to talk, give me a call. And as I said, I'm sorry that I can't be physically in person at the conference to participate in the conversations. I hope the rest of the conference goes swimmingly. Goodbye.